Ted Warner with the Texas Library Association, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Adding Diversity and Inclusion to Your Strategic Plan, with Shani Barrax Moore, who is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Tarrant County College District. She is a native of Raleigh, North Carolina, and she became a diversity practitioner after a career in public relations. She also worked in secondary and higher education as an instructor, administrator, and consultant. And in her previous role as a Director of Diversity and Inclusion, she led her organization through a diversity assessment that served as a model for independent schools around the country. This earned her an appointment to the executive team of a national diversity and inclusion think tank. She has also served as contributing editor and co-author for a handbook on diversity and inclusion published by the National Association of Independent Schools. She joined the Tarrant County College as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer in 2012 and has since created a diversity and inclusion training series, leading the formation of diversity and inclusion councils across the district. And we are very honored to welcome Shani with us today. Welcome, Shani. We're so happy to have you with us. I want to invite you to go ahead and begin the PowerPoint. And just one more note to our audience, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to chat them in the chat box, and I will be tracking those for Shani as we move through the presentation. Shani, please go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Ted, and welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited and to be able to share with you some of what we've learned at Tarrant County College as it relates to diversity and inclusion and how we've tried to institutionalize that here. Those of you, we're all in Texas, so you may be familiar with Tarrant County College. We are actually pretty large. We're the 15th largest college in the country, apparently. We're a community college, obviously, so we're 2-year, and we are multi-campus. We have 5 campuses and our district offices as well. We have, when you consider our credit and non-credit students, about 100,000 students, so we're pretty large. We have about 56% students of color. We have about 6,000 full and part-time employees. I think we're one of the largest employers in Tarrant County. And our Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion was founded in 2010 as part of our overall Vision 2015 strategic plan, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But just to give you some sense of what we're going to do today, first, we're going to talk about how diversity and inclusion has evolved over time, from diversity to diversity and inclusion and then to equity. And then we'll talk about what it looks like to institutionalize that in your organizations. And then I'll share with you what our journey has been at Tarrant County College. We are admittedly still on that journey, so if we were to talk again in a year or two, we'd have a better picture of what this experiment that we're doing of sorts kind of looks like, but that's what we'll be doing today. So to jump right in, I wanted to share with you this evolution of diversity, because diversity has really, even what it's called, has gone through quite an evolution over the last several years. In the early stages, it was obligatory, really. It was affirmative action and compliance. It was more a requirement, so therefore it wasn't strategic. It was more of a thou shalt, as opposed to necessarily looking at it from a strategic perspective. Then we moved from just compliance to, that's when it started being called diversity. And it was more about representation. And it evolved even from there to be primarily focused on women and people of color, to a number of different dimensions of diversity that we'll talk about in a moment. And you all have probably seen this diversity wheel. It might be a bit hard to see here. And then probably about 15 years ago, diversity started evolving from just diversity and representation. And historically, it was really representation of traditionally and historically underrepresented groups. And then it evolved to inclusion. So that was more about taking into account, even if you have a critical mass and just even representation at all, what are the experiences of folks within the organization? So for you all, with all of you working at libraries, you would be thinking about how are our constituents, whether they're employees or students or customers, experiencing your library, both as employees and as end users. And then now we're into a time where it's evolved into not only diversity and inclusion, but equity. Our campus, our district actually just had a whole summit related to student development services and equity, and that was really the focus. So that's really adding diversity and inclusion to create an equitable climate where we're really affirming all identities. And that what we have found through research is that when people feel affirmed, they're a lot more fully engaged. But sometimes it's difficult to kind of know what it looks like in order to be able to do that. So speaking of evolution, I'd be interested to hear from you all, and you all have a poll button. Ted can probably tell you where that poll button is. I'm interested to hear from you all. Where do you think your library is on this continuum? Are you at compliance? Are you at diversity and representation? Are you at inclusion, where you're really actively affirming identities? Or are you at the point where you feel like you really are in an environment that is equitable? I'm seeing folks respond. Okay. So many of you aren't sure. Some of you feel like you're at the point of equitable climate. That's good. And some of you feel you're at representation. Okay, the numbers are changing a bit. So it's good to know where you are and think about where you are on the front end of this discussion. And, I'm sort of asking you on the fly, so you may have a different answer actually by the time we get to the end of this discussion. But as we are having this conversation, I'd like you to think about how does all of this information about institutionalizing diversity and inclusion relate to where you currently are? And then you'll be able to answer the question a lot better as to how, what the journey will look like for you based upon whether you're starting from compliance or whether you're already at the point where you want to create an equitable climate. So thank you for answering that. Okay, so diversity, as I mentioned, in the early days, it was more about gender and race and ethnicity. The definition of diversity has really evolved, and every organization may have a different definition of diversity. This is Tarrant County College's definition of diversity, and the top two rows are what we typically call core identifiers: gender, race, religion, age, ability, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity are typically called core identifiers because often when you ask someone what has the most impact on your perceptions, experiences, and interactions, many people, not all necessarily, may answer that it's some of these. However, we have added veteran status because we do have a lot of programs that are specifically focused on veterans, and of course, being a higher ed, institution of higher education, we're wanting to make sure that we can provide open access to all students, but certainly veterans as well. And I'm going to talk to you in a little bit about our diversity and inclusion survey that we did, but as a result of that survey, we've added linguistic heritage and cultural expression to our definition of diversity because we wanted to hear from our own constituents, both students and employees, what should that definition be. And another part of the evolution has been that in years past, the definition of diversity really focused on the singular definition of these things, but we are just starting to get to the point within the last 10 years or so where we're considering the intersectionality of these identities, because most of us are not just our gender, we're not just our socioeconomic status, we're not just our cultural expression. For each of us, the way in which these particular identities are going to impact our perceptions, experiences, and interactions, it will probably vary from person to person, even from everybody in this room. So that's also part of the evolution of diversity. Now, part of the reason that you hear inclusion has been added to the focus of diversity is that many of these identifiers are hidden, that you cannot tell from looking at someone what those identifiers are. And so while we do need to be concerned with representation, we also need to focus a lot on climate. And that's really what inclusion is how are folks experiencing your organization, in your case, whether it's a library as part of a municipality, or whether you're a part of a college. How are you experiencing the organization, and not just those of traditionally underrepresented groups? When I share this definition of diversity with folks here at Tarrant County College, people are actually surprised to hear that we're not just focusing on historically underrepresented groups or groups that have been historically marginalized, that everybody should see themselves represented in this definition of diversity, regardless of whether you're from a traditionally or historically underrepresented group or not. So now you saw that diversity wheel early on, which was one of the earlier, and it's still quite often used very, very often, that a way to demonstrate all the dimensions of diversity. But I like thinking of diversity as an onion, because all of us are really multi-dimensional and multi-layered and multifaceted, and all of us have a number of different layers and dimensions of diversity that make up our perceptions, experiences, and interactions. So the outside layer, or that third layer, that tertiary layer, those are the dimensions of our identity or dimensions of diversity that are the most situational, that are going to change throughout the course of your life. Obviously, one that you all have in common here is job or career. And some of you may have been librarians all of your lives. Some of you may have switched careers. But this tertiary dimension is on the outside, because since it is situational and it has more to do with your surface interactions, they're not going to have the most impact on your perceptions, interactions, and experiences. But when you come into the secondary dimensions, those are a little bit closer to the core. And these are dimensions or identities that often occur at stages in your life. And you notice things like veteran status, education, marital status. Certainly some of these are interconnected. For us as an institution of higher education, we are trying to give folks access to education, and in doing so, we hope that that also changes their socioeconomic status. So you can begin to see how this is a little bit further in, and that those are going to change at stages in your life, but also likely have a lot to do with your perceptions, experiences, and interactions. Now, when you start getting to the core, you start seeing why those primary dimensions are closer to the core and why they're called core identifiers, that these are identifiers, parts of us that, for the most part, we're often born into. They have a lot to do with how we're socialized, how we see the world, how we interact with other people, how we interpret information, how we interpret people. And so they don't change, and they have the most impact because we've lived with them over the course of our lives for the longest, as compared to the secondary or tertiary dimensions. But let me ask you a question. I mentioned to you all that many of these dimensions are hidden, and I'd like to pose to you as a poll, as another pose question, what percentage of these dimensions of diversity in this onion that you see here do you think are hidden? When you really take a look at those and just answer onto the poll there that I think Ted is going to put up in a moment, what percentage of these do you think are hidden? Okay, so I see 50%. Okay, so many of you are saying 75%. That seems to be the most popular answer right now. Okay, are folks still voting? Okay, so the majority of you have responded that you think it's about 75%. Ted, I'm going to click end poll here, okay? Or is there any way that you can remove the poll there? Okay. So in actual fact, when you look at this, 95% of these dimensions of diversity are hidden, where you cannot tell from looking at someone outside of the one that is always available and visible is appearance. That is something that you can sometimes change, And you've noticed that I've got grayed out gender, race, and age. Certainly, as we're becoming a more multicultural society, both in the United States and even globally, you have a lot more multiracial people, which makes race and ethnicity a bit more ambiguous now. Age is certainly one that I've gotten wrong a lot, both on the low end and the high end. And then also gender. We are here at in higher education, and some of you may be able to attest to this, that we are starting to see a much higher population of transgender students. And so we're actually putting a lot more of our efforts into understanding gender identity. But this is why inclusion has been a lot of our focus, because all of us are a series of these hidden dots, and you really don't know what is behind those dots and what of those dimensions are having the most impact on one's perceptions, experiences, and interactions. So when I show this to people, it's always interesting to see the aha moments that go, that the light bulbs that go off above people's heads when they really realize that the only thing that we can really see is appearance. So with that being said, I want us to talk more about inclusion and the role of inclusion in creating inclusive climates. And I talk about inclusion as climate management because in reality, when you can have a critical mass and you can do a lot to recruit a diverse, whether it's a diverse student population or a diverse employee population, but if you're not really paying attention to the climate and being intentional about inclusion, then you're not going to really receive those benefits of diversity. And so that's why it really does require full participation from everyone to really impact the climate, both from the highest levels at change leadership and otherwise. So first, here's what I mean. So inclusion as climate management means that you have to affirm these dimensions and all the perspectives and experiences and abilities that come with that. Now, because they're hidden, there's obviously some intentionality that has to occur in finding out what those dimensions are. And then secondly, they need to be expressed in what I call the 4 Ps: policies, practices, programs, and people. That is really how you institutionalize really any initiative or value, and it should be evident through cultural norms, communication, composition. That certainly goes to people. And then even as it relates to communication, who is allowed to have a place at the decision-making table? Is it just based upon people at the highest levels, or is there equity and parity across your organization in terms of input and voice? And then in order for it to really be institutionalized, it should be active. It's something that doesn't kind of happen by osmosis. It's got to be something that's active and intentional to facilitate culture change. And that's really important because I think a lot of people will say, oh, well, we're inclusive, but if you're not really thinking about all of these dimensions on this wheel here, then you're not really sure if it's being institutionalized in your organization. And here's the thing that I really want to focus on here is that it requires personal and institutional self-reflection. And this is another part of the evolution of the practice of diversity and inclusion, because in years past, it was more about learning about the other and not really thinking about that self-reflection and awareness, awareness of things like bias, awareness of things like socialization and the role that plays in creating and maintaining an inclusive climate. So that is a huge paradigm shift for some people, but that's also why that in order to have true culture change, there needs to be some collective participation in this institutional and cultural self-reflection. So I want to share something with you. I'm sure many of you have heard the term color blindness. And I say color blindness, but thinking back to what it is I just shared with you about the dimensions of diversity, this can apply to gender, race, religion, age, ability, sexual orientation, etc. So it's applicable to any of the dimensions that I mentioned. What do you think this means? What do you think I mean? And I'd like you to put it here in the chat box. What do you think it means? This graphic here with color blindness, kind of with the line through it. Seeing everyone as being the same, okay. That's definitely something that we often hear, acknowledging diversity and different backgrounds of people. Okay, so color blindness is acknowledging diversity, okay. That's certainly something, I'm sure you all have seen this term before, looking at a clear state, okay. I'm interested in seeing, it's an old term. People should not be colorblind, but color inclusive. I think Sarah Tusa said this, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Sarah, but I really like what Sarah said, that people should not be colorblind, people should be color inclusive. And we had if Danelle Toots from here at Tarrant County College, she was probably at the same summit that we had yesterday, where our Student Development and Success Institute, the focus of it this year was access, equity, and diversity. And one of the things that we did was watch a TED Talk on color blindness, and the speaker said that we should not be color blind, we should be color brave. And that's what a lot of you are pointing out here. Yes, okay, Danelle said, yes, Shani, it's me. That we should be color brave. And I think the reason that we've heard the term color blindness for so long is that we've come out of a time where to acknowledge seeing someone's differences. So I have the camera on so you all can see that I am an African American woman. By saying, Shani, I see you as a black woman, we often had so many stereotypes and assumptions because we were sort of living in separate worlds for so long, because we just really relatively recently came out of a time of segregation, that we were just going to say, oh, I'm not going to see your difference. Because by seeing difference, this is typically what would happen. That to see difference, you would see stereotypes inherent in the differences. And so rather than acknowledging the differences, you're seeing these stereotypes here and not really seeing the real person. So it's interesting when I show that graphic that people didn't know that they weren't supposed to be colorblind, which is why it is a paradigm shift, and that is really part of this evolution of diversity, that we have to learn to see differences and affirm differences, and you can't really have intentional inclusion without being able to really affirm those differences. So this is why I'd like to share with you this notion of cultural humility. And most of us have heard the term cultural competence, which, as I mentioned, cultural competence historically has meant learning about the other. But cultural humility is a term that's come out of the medical community. And really what that means is it's allowing culturally competent individuals, so that would imply that you have some knowledge of other cultures, to acknowledge the presence of differences and the importance of these differences. So you can't have cultural humility if you're operating from a space of colorblindness. And to acknowledge the different perspectives, experiences, interactions that may result from those differences. And in order to really realize the benefits of a diverse environment, whether it's a diverse student body, whether it's a diverse employee population, a diverse community, that you have to constantly acknowledge the compromises that have to take place as a result of those different perspectives that come from those different identifiers, to realize the benefits of diversity and to be able to practice intentional inclusion. But here's where cultural humility is markedly different from cultural competence. Cultural competence is very much about externally learning about the other. Cultural humility has to do with holding up the mirror. It's, it's very cliched, but that saying, it's not a destination, it's a journey. It's something you're continually doing yourself. It's self-reflection, self-critique. How might my perspective differ from another person's perspective? And how might the way something that I say may be interpreted differently by someone else who may look just like me? But if they have a different set of experiences, then you really get the full benefit of those interactions with diverse individuals. So this notion of cultural humility is really that which we have focused on and all of our diversity and inclusion efforts here at Tarrant County College. And while we realize that it's important to learn about other cultures, we have really decided to provide opportunities for awareness for people to learn more about themselves. And people are finding certainly that is really helping them and helping us collectively in our process of achieving institutional equity. So that's a good transition into thinking, how do we institutionalize this notion? We talked about what intentional inclusion looks like. We talked a little bit about cultural humility and thinking about the roles that we play individually. I'd like to share with you, first, ask you, what do you think is the difference between equality and equity? You've heard me mention equity, but I'd like you to go back to the chat box and share with me what you think the difference is between equality and equity. And Danelle, you're not allowed to answer because you saw this yesterday. Color, okay, so people are still responding. Many people have heard the term equity, but they're not quite sure what that means. And many people confuse equality with equity, and it's a relatively new term. So multiple attendees are typing. Okay, April Cole says equality is treating everyone the same. Equity is treating everyone with value. Okay. Equality is everything the same for everyone, not sure about equity. Okay. Equity is a term that means that everyone has an opportunity to have a seat at the table. That's a really good perspective, Esther. So equity is very different from equality. And those of you that said that equality is treating everyone the same, that is indeed true. And many of you may have seen this graphic. Equity means, okay, everyone has a seat at the table. Those of you that have seen this graphic, I don't know if you can see this well, but in the equality graphic, it's about sameness. It's presuming that everyone needs the same thing. So you're going to give everybody, regardless of their need, the exact same thing. Whereas equity is taking into account, you can look at those three figures there and you can tell one of them doesn't need a box to see over the fence to really see the game. One of them only needs one box and one of them only needs two boxes. So in order to really achieve equity, number one, you've got to notice they look differently. They have different needs, and be able to acknowledge and affirm the fact that they have different needs. And equality really is a 20th century, what I call a 20th century model, because even 50, 40 years ago, if you use the analogy of the game, people knew that there was a game going on. They could hear the cheers of the crowds. They can hear the loudspeaker. But equality was just give me a ticket to get into the game. And so that was when we looked at the evolution of diversity and inclusion, that is what compliance looked like. In the 21st century, now that many of our organizations are equal opportunity organizations, what that really means is we're going to take into account what your needs are, what your different perspectives, experiences, and interactions are, what gaps, what opportunity gaps may exist, and we're going to take that into account. And here's one thing that we have to remember, that equity is not always fair, okay? Giving people what they need doesn't mean that everybody's going to get the same thing. And that is a huge paradigm shift for some people, because this notion of let's just treat everybody the same is a bit outdated. But by allocating your resources based upon need, that's what fairness looks like. And that's really the direction that we want to go into if you're really trying to incorporate diversity and inclusion institutionally into a strategic plan. So how do we do that? So there are a lot of different ways that one can go about doing that, and I'm going to share with you some of the ways that Tarrant County College has done this that we have seen success with. The first is that you have to know who you are, and that's the diversity part. Who's represented, who's in the room, who's in your organization, and then what is the climate for everyone? What is the climate for everyone that's a part of your organization? Then you have to figure out how you're going to engage those people. How do you engage everyone and help everyone to realize that they have a role to play in creating an inclusive climate? And how can we participate in that role to facilitate culture change? And then finally, that's all well and great, but if we're not holding people accountable for their behaviors, if there's not an institutional commitment from the highest levels, then you can do the assessment, you can have the engagement, but it's not going to get institutionalized in a way that's really effective. And so then the thing that we have to ask ourselves is, based upon number one, where you think your organization is, and number two, your willingness, what role you can play in achieving institutional equity and what role you're willing to play. Because that was one of the reasons why I asked you at the very beginning where you thought your organization was, because a lot of times the roles that we play aren't easy sometimes, and it takes a while to get to that point where you really have institutional equity. But part of the first step sometimes is just knowing where to begin. So I'm going to share with you how we did this at Tarrant County College. Now, I shared with you at the very beginning that the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion was started in 2010. And I think the reason that we've been able to move along on this journey is because part of our Vision 2015 strategic plan for the college, for the entire college, that strategic plan included diversity and included two goals: assessing our current status of diversity, doing a qualitative and a quantitative assessment to identify representation, institutional practices, and climate, and developing a resulting strategic plan. So this is how we did our qualitative and quantitative assessments. They started out with the focus groups shortly after the Office of Institutional Diversity was founded in 2010. And then we moved into the quantitative stage of our plan and of this process, where when I first came on board 2 years ago, I mentioned that we are a multi-campus district, and every one of our campuses, quite frankly, has a different culture. We are now moving to a one college, 5 campuses, but I needed to know, particularly because we decided that we were going to use our own assessment tool, because I felt very strongly that we wanted to make sure that we were evaluating and assessing our community based upon who we were and not based upon someone else's questions. So I did campus visits at each of our campuses so that I got a sense of campus operations, campus climate, how all of that factored in into the ethos of the campuses. And then I created a slate of questions. And I want to stop here and mention that this whole process was by design very collaborative. It may have taken a little longer in doing so, but we have found, though, that because all along the way we did a draft of questions, we provided input sessions, even on the survey questions, and we sent out the survey to all students and employees. Everyone with a Tarrant County College email, every student and every employee with a Tarrant County College email got this survey, and it was done online. It was sent via email, and so that we used the data from this survey to create our strategic plan. So some of the questions that we asked, you can see here, these were the types of questions that we posed to our students and employees, and we intentionally posed some of the same questions to both students and employees, so we can identify whether there's synergy among our students and employees around certain areas. And so these were things like, what should the role of diversity and inclusion be? That's actually how we added we added linguistic heritage and cultural expression to our definition of diversity, because we wanted to ask our community, what do you think we should add? What should our definition be? We asked things like, should questions about your experience with diverse populations be part of the interview process? So that's an example of the role of diversity and inclusion. We asked students and employees access to resources. For students, things like access to financial aid, access to learning resources. For our employees, access to professional development, practices of the college. We asked questions like, are you allowed enough time off to observe religious holidays. And what we found, for example, is that as one could expect, if you were not a member of the Christian faith, if you were, say, Jewish, or if you were Muslim, that we don't come to work on Christmas, for example. But for other cultures, that wasn't the case. Questions about cultural competence and humility. How comfortable do you feel talking about or leading discussions about diversity and inclusion? Climate and personal experiences was a huge part of the survey, and that's what our diversity and inclusion councils are working on now, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then here, demographics and hidden identifiers. One of the reasons that I showed you that onion and how most of those identities are hidden is because typically when you fill out a form or you apply for a job, you're asked things like just gender, race, and ethnicity. We took it a step further and we wanted to know things like sexual orientation, religious practices. For our students, we used Pell Grant status as a proxy for socioeconomic status, and then we could do cross tabulations based upon, for all of these really, based upon the experiences of our employees and students based upon their identity. And that was hugely helpful for us because all of these hidden identifiers and these populations within the TCC community that we didn't know we had, we could find out the climate and the personal experiences of those folks. I'll mention that while we are a very large college, we distributed this to everyone. We had about over 1,400 employees that applied from across the district, and almost 4,300 students that responded to the survey from across the entire district. So the good thing is that we were able to collect a lot of quantitative data and corroborate that with the qualitative data from the focus groups to create the resulting strategic plan for diversity and inclusion. So I mentioned the strategic plan for diversity and inclusion. The good thing about this plan is that it is entirely data-based. And one thing I'll mention here is that I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Achieving the Dream, but Tarrant County College is an Achieving the Dream institution, and that's an initiative that's focused on community college, where we are an evidence-based culture, where we use data for everything. So it was really validating to our community to say, this isn't just something that Shani Barrax Moore came up with. This strategic plan for diversity and inclusion was based upon the data that you, our students and employees, provided, and that we are creating a strategic plan based upon what it is you as the community told us that we need to focus on. And I mentioned that this process was collaborative. We had a number of different input sessions, so there were several versions of the strategic plan, and we provided an opportunity for members of the community to weigh in on it, faculty, staff, students, and administrators. We even worked with public relations and marketing to figure out how this should be presented so that it was digestible to people. And we came up with 3 main goals as the result of the diversity and inclusion survey and in the plan. It's institutional infrastructure and practices, which really is how do we just make sure that this isn't the flavor of the month and that this really becomes a part of Tarrant County College's culture and organizational DNA. Employee training and development, where I'll talk about in a moment. And the third goal, institutional climate and intergroup relations, which is where a lot of our action planning is focused upon and where our diversity and inclusion councils are doing a lot of the work in implementation. We had initially in earlier versions of the plan curriculum enhancement, which really had to do with curricula. But what we decided is we needed to provide our employees and students, particularly faculty, if we're going to ask faculty to infuse this into their curricula, we needed to give them an opportunity to have some of these discussions. And for you all as librarians, this may be a corollary or parallel to your library programming, or if you are in a library at a school, any kind of educational institution, how you would provide supporting resources in the curricula. So this is how it may be applicable to your organization, but our plan is really designed to focus on every constituent within TCC, faculty, staff, students, administrators, and we're even doing some work with our boards. We have a board of directors for our TCC Foundation and also our board of directors for the college. So I'm going to just break down for you the three goals, so you have a sense of the kind of information that's in there. And this is really part of our executive summary. First, we also want to make sure, I often say that we want our outsides to look like our insides. So we're doing a lot of analyses of our employee base. We obviously know who our students are, but our employee base, and making sure that because we're a public institution and we are here to serve the Tarrant County College community, that we look like the Tarrant County College community. And then we're looking at our recruitment strategies. We do have a diversity recruitment plan because we want our outsides to look like our insides, but to make sure that that is consistent across the district. I talked about an accountability system so that this really permeates throughout the district. And you notice I have here engaging the Chancellor's Executive Leadership Team, which we call the KELP. We've actually started having some conversations with the Chancellor and the Executive Leadership Team about the strategic plan and how they can support this. Because that's one thing that we heard loud and clear from our diversity and inclusion councils, that in order for this to truly be institutionalized, that we needed their buy-in and they needed to be part of those conversations. Developing external partnerships in order to support some of the goals of the plan, and then making this part of our branding strategy. We want folks to know that this is a part of the TCC experience, both for our employees and for our students. So that's really, for us, what institutionalizing diversity and inclusion looks like. The other is training and development. We have started requiring, as part of the training that we have for employees, we've added we use Skillsoft as our online learning module. So we've added a required module on diversity and inclusion. Also, I should mention that in our onboarding of employees, all of our employees participate in week-long training. One of those training modules that our employees get is a 4-hour session on diversity and inclusion at Tarrant County College. So it sets the tone very early on that this is something that's important to us as a district. We have also started offering many, many more trainings to our employee base, and to some degree students as well, so that people are having opportunities to experience cultural humility. And finally, institutional climate and intergroup relations. You heard me mention the diversity and inclusion councils. This is what our D&I councils are really focusing on, taking the data for their campuses. I mentioned that we're a huge organization, and each campus got an opportunity to see what their data said about their campus. Danelle is actually on one of our diversity and inclusion campuses, councils at the Trinity River campus. So they're taking that data from the diversity and inclusion survey and providing opportunities for dialogue and awareness and development around themes that occurred for their particular campus, and creating an action plan. We're building capacity, so that I probably should have mentioned that the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion is made up of myself and an admin assistant. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're training additional people to help to facilitate cultural humility across the district. We do have, because we have a number of different campuses, we have these identity-based student organizations, and by those I mean organizations formed around gender, race, religion, etc. And so that we want to build capacity and bring all of those student organizations together so that they can even become trained, perhaps, to deliver some of this awareness to their peers. And then finally, creating employee resource groups, also known as affinity groups. And these are groups that are formed around those identifiers. So there might be a women's employee resource group. There might be an African American or Hispanic and Latino employee resource group, or a gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender employee resource group. That's very common in industry. And also a staff association. We have a faculty association. And we're looking at starting some sort of staff advisory committee, because certainly what we have found is that diversity and inclusion and identities, it's not just based upon those core identifiers that I mentioned, but it's also based upon job title and position, and making sure that everyone feels as though that they're treated fairly and equitably regardless of what role or title they have within the college. So you've heard me mention many, many different times that we have these diversity and inclusion councils. These councils are tasked with, well, let me go back. One of the things that I did as we were rolling out the strategic plan for diversity and inclusion, I went to every campus and shared the data, the overall data from the diversity and inclusion survey, and then I shared that data juxtaposed with the data for that particular campus. So the diversity and inclusion councils are made up of faculty, staff, students, and administration on each of our campuses. We also have a council for our district office, which obviously doesn't include students because those are all employees, but they are taking that campus-based data and creating a 3-year action plan for their campus to implement primarily the institutional climate and intergroup relations goals of the strategic plan for diversity and inclusion. And these folks really serve as ambassadors of the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion. Many of these folks function as associates, as I mentioned, that were training folks to help deliver and facilitate some of this cultural humility. And then one of the things that we did that we realized is that we had people who were appointed to, some who were appointed to these diversity and inclusion councils and some who volunteered. So I like to say that there were some people who were volunteered and there were some people who were voluntold to serve on these councils based upon whether it's their role within the college. We intentionally sought out people from all levels, from support staff all the way up to associate vice chancellors. But what we realized is that some of our D&I council members had no experience working with diversity and inclusion. So before we really started to get into implementation, we created a series that provided some really extensive training to our diversity and inclusion council members to help facilitate the implementation of this plan. And so our series is called Foundations of Diversity and Inclusion. And it was initially designed as the training for the diversity and inclusion councils. We are now beginning to offer that to our larger community, and our Chancellor's Executive Leadership Team is actually going through a version of this now. But we start out with really just making sure that people understand the data from the Diversity and Inclusion Survey, why we're doing this. This is what our data says about why we should be doing this. The entire series is based upon findings from the Diversity and Inclusion Survey. This new employee orientation, Free to Be Me at TCC, I mentioned that all of our students, all of our employees get diversity training, diversity orientation, but many of our employees had not received it since we had changed it in fall of 2012. So that's now part of the series. We use the Harvard Implicit Association test to make folks aware of their own biases. We talk about how you may have been socialized to have those biases and how those biases and socialization are authoring our identity and others' identity. We talk about inclusive language because that is really important, because communication is the one thing that we do every day. So we talk about the role of language on creating inclusive environments. We do a whole session on privilege, oppression, and collusion. As I mentioned, that we had our Student Development Summit and Success Summit yesterday, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with Peggy McIntosh, but we actually talk about white privilege. Peggy McIntosh is sort of the mother of white privilege studies, and we talk about white privilege, and we use white privilege and racial privilege as a proxy for other kinds of relative privilege, so that everyone understands that they may have more privilege as it relates to someone else, whether it's related to your gender, whether it's related to your sexual orientation, and how you can use that privilege to be allies for other people. And then finally, we roll that into the end and say, now that you know all of this and you've had all of this opportunity for reflection, how are you going to be a change agent within Tarrant County College to move us towards a climate of intentional inclusion and to help to facilitate this culture change? So I talked a lot about accountability and how one of the things that we did when we piloted Foundations of Diversity and Inclusion last summer is that our Diversity and Inclusion Council members said, we will not get anywhere with this if we do not have buy-in from the highest levels. So that's why we're having our Chancellor's Executive Leadership Team go through a version of this Foundations of Diversity and Inclusion. And it's been really rewarding to see these aha moments that at the highest levels our leadership is having. So I can see already that they will be able to help facilitate implementation of this plan. And then one of the things that we want to do is encourage support across the district. So at some point we're going to have engagement goals so that people are allowed to go to some of these activities. And then also we're giving our diversity and inclusion councils, they're going to be really addressing some tough topics because, for example, one of our councils is focusing on inclusive language and the role of inclusive language on creating inclusive climate. Another may be focused on marginalization based upon job title and position and the role of privilege. All of that we gleaned from the diversity and inclusion survey, so we can, as we're going through the strategic plan implementation process, we can say, this is where we got it from. You, the community, said that we should focus on this. So, you know, to bring this to a close, you likely attended this webinar because you're thinking, how can I do this? How can I apply this to my organization? And really what you have to think of is, how ready is your institution to do this? Do you have the support systems and the infrastructure to support intentional inclusion? Has the impact on the institutional climate been articulated? If we do this, what is the impact? And if we don't do this, what is the impact? And if you did do an assessment, would your organization be ready to really do something with the results? Because that's really going to have all kinds of effects if you do assessment but you don't do anything with it. And then the other thing is, are you willing to be a change agent, to use your sphere of influence to facilitate culture change? And if you need to engage people at other levels of your organization, whether it's at higher levels or whether it's just so that it permeates throughout your organization, who else do you need to engage in order to be able to facilitate intentional inclusion throughout your campus? So I know I've talked a lot, and that's really just where we are in our journey at Tarrant County College. And so any questions that you have for us? I see that Ted and Esther are typing. Any observations or things that you think may be barriers for your organization? I see that Esther Garcia is still typing. Let me make sure I'm scrolled all the way down. Excellent. Can you talk about the impact of actions just in our level at libraries? That's a really good question, Esther. I think there are a couple of different things. If you noticed, one of the graphics at the very beginning, I had that you want your library to be open and welcoming to everyone. So you have to think about the climate. You have to think about the composition. You have to think about if our purpose is to serve our community, does our library staff look like the community? Do our collections reflect the interests of the community? The programming that we're providing. So say, for example, if you were going to do some sort of community assessment, if you're a public library, if you're a part of a municipality, maybe there would be some sort of assessment of your constituents to say, what would an inclusive climate look like within the library? What sort of programming would you like to see related to the library? So all of these things can be applied. I'll tell you, there's a really cool program that Danelle did a couple of weeks ago. And Danelle, I've already forgotten, I think it was like an open book campaign where, and I'm probably messing up the name, Danelle, Human Library, thank you, where she provided a great deal of resources on a number of different perspectives on privilege, on socialization, on bias awareness, and those types of things. And then she identified folks from members of the community, and they were an open book. And it was sponsored by the library as part of Library Week, Library Appreciation Week. Danelle, I'm probably going to mess that up again too, what week it was. But that was a wonderful way that the library could help to facilitate cultural humility and really learning from other people's experiences as it relates to their experiences. Good question. Any other questions? I see multiple attendees are typing. But I would actually encourage you to contact Danelle, because that Human Library program was absolutely excellent. And it really demonstrated a way that a library could be very facilitative, really, in helping to facilitate cultural humility. So as far as equity, I've also seen resistance to quota. Can you tell us if that's an issue you've seen or if you've been able to deal with that? Interesting. Yes, one of the things that we discovered on our diversity and inclusion survey is that many of our employees were conveying that they felt that our diversity recruitment policies were tantamount to reverse discrimination. And so this is really why I have started talking a lot more about equity. People have heard about diversity, they've heard about inclusion, but they don't understand what equity means. And so, when I talked about making sure that our insides as a college reflect our outsides as a community, we have to make sure that we're leveling the playing field. If our programming, so if you're looking at it from the perspective of library programming, if your programming is not being responsive to the needs of the community, then you're not really facilitating cultural awareness in a way, particularly as it relates to diversity and inclusion. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but what I found is that when people realize that you're just trying to match the needs of the community that you're trying to serve, that light bulbs start to go off. But it can't be quotas. It's kind of all things being equal, we want to make sure that we are reflective of the community. Yes, frame things in the way of equity, yes. Any other questions or comments? Well, I am going to share my contact information. Oh, there's someone else. I'm particularly concerned about seeing our veterans in library services, but if they don't self-identify, there's no way to make exceptions that may benefit them. Any suggestions on how to evaluate what we do and say that meets veterans' needs? That's a really good question. I think if I were in your position, I would likely, and I don't know, Sheila, if you are at a college or if you're at a public library, and that'll kind of make a difference. For us at TCC, we actually know which of our students, okay, you're at Austin Community College. So you might want to start tracking, whether it's through enrollment services or otherwise, how many veterans you have. One of the things that we do as part of our onboarding is we share how many of our students have indicated that they're veterans, and then whether it's doing some focus groups or whether it's doing some sort of assessment based upon veteran status. We actually asked that on our diversity and inclusion survey, whether you're a veteran. And so we'll be able to pull the data based upon whether you're a veteran. You serve on the Veterans Advisory Committee, yeah. And it's a common problem across disciplines. One of the sessions that we did here at TCC yesterday related to equity was an entire session on veterans and how we can better affirm veteran identity and veteran needs. But I think a lot of times you have to ask them. And until you ask them, you won't really know what their needs are, and they'll come up with things that you didn't even know existed based upon their own perceptions, experiences, and interactions. I hope that helps. So I'm going to share my contact information with you all. Feel free, and Ted, you said that you're going to distribute this to the attendees?
Yes.
Okay. So feel free to contact me. We do have I will tell you that our diversity page is a little bit outdated. But if you have any specific questions, feel free to contact me. And thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Shani. As I said earlier, we will be sharing the recording of this presentation with everyone who registered. And at that time, you'll also receive a little survey about what you thought of the presentation. And so I hope you'll give us some feedback and let us know. But thank you so much. This was a tremendously good presentation with lots and lots of great information that I think our librarians will be able to use.
Oh, great. I'm glad it was helpful. Have a good one, y'all.
Okay, everyone have a good weekend. We'll see you next time.